Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Eric?
Perfect.
Okay,
We
good.
we had a little technical issue earlier, but I think we've got it figured out now. So I think you can hear us here. We can hear you there. We've got the slides shared, and I've got your little clicker here, and so we'll click through the slides. Just let us know next whenever you're ready. And Suzanne will be here near the podium for when you want to transition to her part of the talk as well. So thank you very much, Keith. Take her away.
All right, thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to your group today. What I would like to do is just take the next 20 minutes or so and run through some slides showing some information on the U.S. agricultural growth performance over the last couple of decades, last few decades, how productivity has really driven that performance, and on the critical role of investments in research and development to assure long-term growth in U.S. agriculture, and some of the implications for trade competitiveness as well as environmental sustainability. So let's go to the next slide if we could. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. What I show here is two indexes, one of the total volume of output of agricultural production relative to 1948. So that's where the index is set at to 100, as well as the total volume of inputs used in agriculture that's aggregating up land, labor, capital, and intermediate inputs like seed, feed, and fertilizer. And what the figure illustrates is that well, by the late 2000 teens, that index of output had climbed from 100 to about 280, which means that U.S. agriculture was producing about 2.8 times the quantities of output compared to where it was 70 years ago. But the total amount of inputs in red really hadn't changed at all. Now, there has certainly been changes in the composition of inputs, less labor, less land, more capital, and more intermediate inputs, and I'll come back to that later. But if you aggregate that all up, we see that there's been this tremendous growth in efficiency and productivity. Next slide, please. We measure this through this indicator called total factor productivity, or TFP for short, and we think of this as probably the broadest available measure of how economic efficiency of an economic sector is changing. It's simply a ratio of that total output you're getting for the total inputs that you're using. And so if you want to grow a sector, if you want to produce more, you either bring more resources into production, more land, labor, or capital, or you raise the productivity of those resources. And in US agriculture, growth has been all about raising productivity. Now, where does this productivity growth come from? Well, a lot of it is new technology that's coming out of the R&D pipeline, being disseminated to farmers. Some of it is through economies of scale. Sometimes larger farms can get greater economies and raise productivity, get more output for the resources that they're putting into production. Also, sometimes you can get productivity gains from specialization, including regional specialization. So if markets are more open, each region can specialize in the commodities that they produce best, and you can get some productivity gains that way. Next slide, please. Now, this increase in TFP and the way we measure it has direct implications for both trade competitiveness as well as profitability of the agricultural sector. Because basically, what a 1% increase in TFP means that for a given volume of output, you're using 1% fewer resources. That means a 1% reduction in the unit cost of production, that's so long as prices don't change. But of course, prices do change over time. And in particular, we see in agriculture that the prices farmers often pay for inputs are rising faster than the prices farmers receive for the products they sell. So that's what we call kind of an adverse or declining terms of trade facing agriculture. But if your TFP is rising, that can help offset that adverse terms of trade and keep your sector profitable. Next slide, please. So we can drill down a little bit more into this, we call it a growth decomposition, or say, where is the growth in agricultural production coming from? I mentioned it's been primarily from these increases in total factor productivity, but I also wanted to point out that if we look at the input the inputs that are used, I want to focus here on both changes in agricultural land and then in the use of inputs per unit of land, what I call input intensification. So one way to raise yield is to increase the amount of inputs you use on each agriculture, each acre of farmland, use more fertilizers, more capital, more labor, for example. And that will contribute to yield, but that comes at an increased cost of those inputs. And in fact, that kind of growth source also runs into diminishing returns, that the more fertilizers you apply, the less and less increment you get to yield, and eventually you can cap out in terms of how much growth you can get through input intensification. Whereas for total factor productivity, which is more of a long run growth process being driven by, as I said, investments which we often refer to as knowledge capital, R&D, as well as extension and education that enable farmers to use new technologies better and adopt new farm practices more efficiently and more quickly. It's a long-term process that really doesn't seem to show evidence of diminishing returns. So long as we maintain R&D investments, we can continue to expect new technologies to raise productivity so long as farmers can get access to them. Next slide, please. So in this figure, I've kind of decomposed the growth performance of US agriculture into these three sources, going back to the decades of the 60s up to the present. So the first column shows the average annual rates of change for the decades of the 60s and 70s. So the black line is how fast output was growing at almost 2% per year during these two decades. And TFP was growing, as well as input intensification was growing, but land area was actually falling. So changes in land use was a negative growth rate. And so you had yields growing faster, almost 2.8%, that green part and the yellow part together is how fast your yield is growing. And some of that yield was coming from input intensification, and some of it was coming from TFP. And the input intensification was really just offsetting the decline in agricultural land. So the net growth was really being driven by improvements in TFP. Now that second graph, that's the decade of the 80s and 90s. And we can see that TFP was growing exceptionally fast during this period. There wasn't much input intensification taking place during this period. You can remember, farm prices were low. In fact, in the 80s, the farm sector was in a recession, but it was still able to grow through the application of improved technologies and other factors that were raising growth performance of productivity. So that output was still growing by almost 2% per year. Now, the second two columns show the growth performance of the decade of the 2000s and the 2000 teens. And we can see the steady decline in the rate of output growth, that black line. And this is primarily due to a slowdown in the growth rate of TFP, of productivity. In fact, during the last decade, there's been very little TFP growth in US agriculture on average. Now, some components may still be seeing, some growth in productivity, but it could be offset by declining productivity in other parts of the aid sector. So in Florida, for example, citrus greening has had a huge impact on the orange industry, reducing yields and raising farmers' costs. So that's been an area where we've seen negative growth in productivity. And if we look at the ag sector as a whole across the whole country, we see basically stagnant growth in productivity over the last decade. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that a key driver of productivity over the long run is our research and development enterprise and how much we're investing in research and development. So I wanted just to take a moment to show you what the trends are and the structure, and remind ourselves of the structure of that enterprise we call research and development, at least in the public sector. So we're spending about $5 billion every year on public agricultural R&D across the federal and state system. This is a federal and state partnership. The federal government funds about 70% of public ag R&D in the country. The state governments contribute another big share of that, and non-government sources or other sources, that includes private sector funding for public research, both the nonprofit foundations as well as businesses contracting some research at universities. But a big share of it too is that universities raise some money for research, say through technology fees or patent licenses and so forth. So that's also a contributing factor here. So the federal government spends about, in 2019, about $3.2 billion on agricultural research. Most of that was funneled through the USDA, both for intramural research at USDA research agencies, such as my own agency, the Economic Research Service, although by far the largest component here is done by the Agricultural Research Service. Some other federal agencies, such as the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, also fund some agricultural research. But most of the agricultural research in the United States is actually performed by the state institutions, the land-grant universities, the state experiment stations, forestry schools, veterinary schools, historically Black colleges and universities, and other cooperating institutions. So they do about 2/3 of the research, although the federal government's funding about 70% of it. Next slide, please. If we look at the funding trend over time, however, we've seen that it's actually fallen in inflation-adjusted dollars since peaking about 2 decades ago. So now we're back to about $5 billion a year, where we were actually back in 1970. Now, what that means is that there are basically about 1/3 fewer agricultural scientists working at public ag R&D institutions today than there were 2 decades ago, around 2002 at that peak. So that means that there could be fewer new technologies coming down the agricultural pipeline. And this could be one reason why, quite a likely reason actually, why we do see a slowdown in that TFP growth rate. Next slide, please. So some of the factors that are challenging our ability to continue to grow productivity in agriculture is this declining investment in agricultural R&D. Now, to some extent, this may have been offset by increases in private sector R&D, but we don't have complete data on private R&D, and I suspect that that has not kept up with that decline we see in the public side. We also can be constrained by certain consumer apprehensions with some new technologies or farming practices. So this may limit choices as to what kinds of technologies we could use to raise productivity. Climate change, if we have increased frequency of severe droughts or severe periods of heat during key crop growth periods, that could also have a negative effect on productivity and actually cause productivity to decline. And then environmental issues, particularly water scarcity in Western states, but also here in Florida. Competition for irrigation water for other uses can be another big constraint on growth. Next slide, please. Let me just take a few minutes and talk about the trade competitiveness and what some of the implications are and how the U.S. stacks up with some of our major trading partners in agriculture and other sectors. So here I've looked at, first of all, trends in funding of public agricultural R&D, the US versus China, India, Brazil, and then the European Union, which is a group of 27 countries together. So back 2 decades ago, the US was by far the world's leader in agricultural R&D spending more than any other single country, but we were surpassed by China around 2007 or 2008. And the last information we have available for China was this 2015. They at that time looked like they were spending over $10 billion a year on agricultural R&D compared to $5 billion in the United States. Where our spending fell, other countries continued to increase their spending on agricultural R&D. Now, these 5 countries or groups of countries together account for, I think, about 60% of the total global agricultural output. So this is a big share of what's going on globally. Next slide. Now let's look at how these countries have performed in terms of raising productivity of their agricultural sectors. Again, we're using our TFP index. Here I've indexed all the countries' TFP at 100 in the year 2000 to see how much it's changed in the last 20 years. Brazil, India, and China and the EU 27 have all raised their agricultural productivity faster than the United States. And as I mentioned, since over the last decade, there's been really very little growth in average TFP in the United States. So this means that we could be falling behind in our ability to reduce costs and maintain competitiveness in international ag markets. One more slide, and then I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne. I just wanted to point out that when we talk about raising agricultural productivity, it's not the same thing as raising production. So productivity basically means not necessarily producing more, but sometimes producing more, but certainly always sort of producing more with less. And I wanted to illustrate this by just contrasting North America and the EU 27 over their sort of agricultural growth profile and productivity profile over the last 30 years. So USA and Canada have seen output that the blue line, compared to 1990, by 2020, we were producing about 50% more output of agricultural crops and livestock than in 1990. And most of that growth had come because we were raising total factor productivity. The red line had grown only about 20%. That's total inputs. Canada has been expanding inputs faster than the United States. In the EU 27, in contrast, they haven't really increased output very much at all. That blue line is still at about 100 in 2020. So basically where it was in 1990. But they're using about 20% fewer total resources. The red line is below 80 on that index. And they've been able to maintain output at 1990 levels despite the decline in inputs because they've also increased their productivity. Now I've superimposed on this graph also this orange line, which is one environmental impact of agriculture. This is the greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the agricultural sector, which comes out of ruminant livestock, from fertilizer, from land use change. And we can see that that kind of tracks the, how much inputs you use. So in the North America, even as we increased output by 50%, greenhouse gas emissions stayed flat. So we were reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output because we were raising productivity. In the EU, they were actually showing fewer greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture because they were reducing input use in agriculture. And again, they were reducing greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output. So here we see that TFP is contributing not only to profitability and competitiveness, but it's also improving long-run sustainability by reducing the intensity of environmental resources used in the sector. So with that, I'd like to now turn this over to Suzanne. We can go to the next slide, who's going to kind of bring this back to, what this means for Florida and policy, and particularly the debate around the upcoming Farm Bill. So Suzanne, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Keith. That was really interesting and a great introduction. And I think, so my piece of this in just a few slides is to try to bring some of these things together that we've talked about this morning. So we're going to talk about, you know, how the Farm Bill discussions tie into this. We're going to talk about how the research and development investments in science and in those sectors tie in. And then, you know, how does that impact Florida? And so I'm going to use just a few examples. You guys may remember I talked to this conference, a year or two ago, Derek, and I talked way too long. And so I wanted to just say selected examples up here. So first one is a program that I know all the university folks are intimately familiar with. This is out of USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and this is sort of their big investment program in funding extramural or outside of the government R&D in food and research. And so AFRI is the acronym that you hear all the time. And so you can see that between fiscal year 2002 and 2022, this particular program awarded over $4.2 billion in investment in R&D in these sectors, 154 million to Florida. And the chart actually shows the dollars awarded to Florida and what areas those were in, so sort of broadly defined areas. So you can see that it really covers the gamut, right? From climate to breeding, food safety, plant systems. It depends on how they're defining their priority areas from year to year, but you can see where that's gone. And then I just pulled out, this is like a very, very short list of Florida examples of projects that have been funded here in the state, but I wanted to give just a sense of how broadly these things are applied to needs and issues that have come up in the state as the various universities, of course, University of Florida, but also the other universities in the state work with our partners. So this is one program. And how does this tie to the Farm Bill? I want to make sure I tie the pieces together. These are programs that are funded through Farm Bill discussions on investment in research and development. And if you think back to what we saw a little bit earlier this morning, and sort of Farm Bill, where they're spending their dollars, I believe it was something less than 1% of those Farm Bill dollars are going to R&D. So this is drilling down from that 1%. So this second program I put up here is a specialty crop research initiative. And again, I know people here are really familiar with this. This has been very, very focused on obviously specialty crops and their needs. And it's a fairly unique program in that the industries, the growers really have a lot of direct impact and say into this program, not just in setting priorities, but they actually have an industry relevance review for projects and proposals that are submitted. So for those of you that are out there in the industry, this is a chance when you can actually have a direct say on what your priority needs are and get a chance to look at some of these proposals early on and say, yes, this is really helping us focus on where we have, a critical need, or, okay, it's important, but not necessarily our first most immediate need. So there's more of a direct impact here. Again, this program, SCRI, you'll hear that acronym, awarded about $946 million over this period to all of the states. And you can see Florida received about 15% of those dollars. And I should say, just my little asterisk at the bottom, that doesn't include all the sub awards. So these are very, very big projects, sometimes across multiple states. So if dollars, for example, were awarded to a university in Georgia as the prime, but Florida was participating, doing a lot of the work, and that's not counted in this 15%. And again, you can just see the broad range of Florida examples that have been funded under here. This is a very short list. And one more I want to mention, this is the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. Again, dollars flow through the Farm Bill and sometimes in different ways than some of the others. But this is really interesting. These are dollars that are actually awarded to the states, right? So here in Florida, it's our Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. The dollars are flowed through them. And then they set priorities. So again, it's a way to try and identify priorities that are particularly relevant to states, because we all know that the needs are very, very different, right, across different states. So this lets the Department of Ag get in, set those priorities, have an input in where it goes, and then look at proposals and talk about where what the highest needs are. So a little bit different set of years here, but $583 million to all states over this period of time. Florida was about 6% of that. And again, you can see the different priorities that have been identified over time. So just some key takeaway points, and this is from Keith and myself both, but of course, you know, agriculture and the future of agriculture and competitiveness really depends critically on being able to raise some of this productivity for growth. And how do we do that? And Keith talked a lot about that. Productivity growth can also reduce some of the environmental footprint, reduce some of those inputs that go in to generate more output. But we've seen some stagnation in that over time, particularly as our investment in research and development has been falling not just compared to what we've done in the past, but also compared to some major competitors around the world. This can put U.S. ag at risk in terms of trade and competitiveness. And then our production is at risk of becoming more resource intensive over time. So what you see is the importance of some of these discussions that are coming through the Farm Bill and some of these areas of emphasis and how that ties back to what's happening both broadly and then on the ground to address specific needs here at home. So that's it from us. I said I would be short, and I was. So, Derek?
I think we still have a couple minutes for questions. If we have any questions for Keith or for Suzanne, and then I'll introduce lunch and turn it over to Jack for a second. But just a couple minutes for questions. If we have any from the audience, we'll keep an eye on the Zoom room too.
Sorry, Bill. Trent?
I have a quick question on the growth and productivity in some of the countries, because in some ways, what if they just been leapfrogging using some of the technologies that we developed, and that's led to a lot of their productivity growth?
Yeah, no, I could address that. I think, yeah, I mean, we certainly have seen, low-income countries or developing countries often will experience more rapid productivity growth because they can borrow technology. So, they're starting at low levels of productivity. We often see kind of this catching up. When you reach a frontier, then it becomes, a little harder to raise productivity because then you really rely on new kinds of production technology. So that's why, in countries in like the EU 27 and the United States, productivity generally has not been growing as fast as in many developing countries. But even for developing countries to borrow technology, they need to invest in research and development in order to adapt it to their local conditions. We all know, agriculture again is unique from other sectors in how it is conditioned by local agronomic conditions and climate. And so, these countries, by investing in R&D, makes them more. But I think you're right that then, because they're kind of behind the curve in a lot of ways, they can borrow technology, adapt it to their local conditions, and achieve rapid productivity growth.
So I think Bill had his hand up next, and then Andy after that.
It was right along the same line. So
Okay, Andy?
over a long time. The economists must have done a terrible job in convincing people about these numbers about the productivity change. Your estimates show you've had rate return up to 30% or on hybrid corn up to 70% of the So if all this is true, how come we can't convince people to put more money in R&D? That is what's always in me, but I have open conscience that in a general equilibrium context, the people are convinced that more money is putting that money in a cancer research center than in put in agriculture.
Keith, could you hear okay?
I think, I mean, basically the question is, yeah, we get high returns to R&D. How come we're not doing more, in fact, doing less? So this is a perennial question. I think, you know, my job as an economist is to sort of say, well, this is what we think economic, you know, what the results show in terms of productivity trends. I mean, but those are really political decisions. I think the United States has taken a, you know, has put a lot of hope on the private sector to kind of take the lead in research and development. And in fact, we have seen increases in private spending in agricultural research and development, but a lot of that has been quite focused. You know, much of that has really focused on genetically modified crops for corn, soybeans, and cotton. Once you get beyond that, you know, it gets relatively thin. We also don't think that public and private R&D are direct substitutes. They're really complements. So you have a public sector doing a lot of the basic research, a lot of the fundamental sciences, opening up new technological opportunities for the private sector to then commercialize. So if you don't have those kinds of fundamental breakthroughs taking place, then you also eventually could see, you know, less opportunities for private sector R&D and less investment there. So this is a perennial issue, and I think, you know, we're starting to see some of the consequences of that in slowing productivity growth.
Yeah, I would just add on, I guess I'm really going to repeat a little bit of what Keith just said, but, you know, this model of these big public-private partnerships and investment in research seems to be like kind of the way that there's a lot of interest in proceeding that way right now. But it's still pretty early when you think about research development and development of new technologies, and then moving those into the application phase. So we may be coming back off some of the model that Keith described, where, you know, we've sort of outsourced a lot and separated those two public and private streams and trying to bring them back together. But whether that'll pay off, we don't know yet.
Well, this might be a little, but I was reading through the components of politics. The specialty from the types of funding that nature. Specifically for Florida, have you seen any research on CV?
Yeah, he for him. Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm trying to remember because I gleaned through all the list and I think it's no, but you have a stronger answer than me. So go ahead.
No, there's nothing. I just wanted to add a comment onto that. When the state run faculty block grant program, the review committee is so organized. So if you have a project, please talk to them and they can advocate for you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that'll be good for now. So let's give the speakers a hand.